Let me welcome you to my video, where we will talk about the impact of colonialism within cultures on Canada and India. Colonialism is defined as control by one power over a dependent area or people. It occurs when one nation subjugates another, conquering its population and exploiting it, often while forcing its own language and cultural values upon its people. Canada first got colonized by the Europeans in the 16th century, and then later it was colonized by English in 1583. Whereas for India, Portuguese ruled between 1505 to 1961. It even outlived its English counterpart, the British colonized in 1757. Colonizers can really negatively affect the country even after they have left. Colonization took away indigenous people's culture and identity, causing social problems and making them depend on the government since their traditional ways of life were lost. The loss of indigenous land during colonization caused lasting harm to their communities. Policies like the Indian Act and residential schools tried to force indigenous peoples to adopt the ways of settlers, damaging their cultural practices and traumatizing them for generations. Resource extraction from indigenous land mostly benefited settlers and companies, while indigenous communities were left in poverty. The reserve system and racism caused problems like poor health and violence in indigenous communities. During British rule, India faced poverty, hunger, disease, cultural disruption, economic exploitation, political inequality, and policies that made people feel inferior based on their race and social status. Before British colonization, homosexuality was not illegal in India, but under British rule, it became illegal under Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, a law that remained in place until September 2018. Between 1765 and 1900, $64.82 trillion left India from UK, with than half of it going into the pockets of the richest 10% of the population. Colonization also left a legacy of unemployment, famine, poor living conditions, lack of education and healthcare, caste-based discrimination, religious violence, and gender-based violence. In addition, the British introduced ideas about female beauty that were based on skin color, with lighter skin being seen as more beautiful, a standard that still exists today. French rule versus British rule. French colonization in Canada began in 1608 with Quebec's founding. The French promoted assimilation through Catholic missions, boarding schools, and reserves to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity and French culture. These early systems influenced Canada's later residential schools. British colonization began in 1670 with the Hudson's Bay Company and expanded after the 1763 Treaty of Paris. The British displaced indigenous peoples through treaties, land loss, and policies like the Gradual Civilization Act, which aimed to assimilate them. Residential schools, introduced in the 1830s, isolated indigenous children, erasing their culture and causing intergenerational trauma. French colonialism in India. The French East India Company, established in 1664, set up trading posts in India, Pondicherry. Under Joseph-François Dupleix, the French tried to expand their empire, but after their defeat at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the British took control of Bengal. Despite attempts to regain territory, the French lost influence, and by 1769, France controlled only a small area, with Pondicherry being under direct government control. British colonialism in India. The British East India Company, founded in the early 17th century, gradually took control of India. Policies like the doctrine of lapse annexed Indian states, while the land revenue system exploited farmers. Education focused on Western ideas, neglecting Indian traditions. The partition of Bengal in 1905 aimed to divide communities, and the Indian civil service was dominated by the British. The divide and rule policy weakened Indian unity. While British rule built infrastructure, it also led to economic exploitation and cultural isolation. The similarities between India and Canada because they were colonized by the same country. Canada and India both continue to have prime ministerial systems of government that follow the British Westminster model. The railways and postal networks, as well as many of the foundations of industry of Canada and India, are rooted in the activities of European colonists. British colonial policies undoubtedly caused the dispossession and exploitation of Indians in their own land as well as indigenous people. Canada and India continue to have prime ministerial systems of government that follow the British Westminster model. Today, institutions and geographical features in India and Canada are under a name-changing spree, as part of an attempt to remove colonial linkages and to instead honor homegrown personalities. British influence seen in languages, education, and societal structures. My analysis. Anthropology. Cultural relativism says that each culture should be judged by its own values, not Western ones. However, when Canada got colonized, colonizers disregarded the cultural and spiritual connection indigenous people had to their land, and rather forced them to foreign and more civilized norms and system, which created ongoing conflict over land rights, as indigenous communities tries to restore their authority and cultural practices. Diffusion is the spread of cultural influence between individuals and groups. It can occur with things like food, language, clothing, customs, philosophies, religion, and technology. When British colonized India, diffusion played a huge role in transforming Indian society. They introduced new systems of governance, education, clothing, which were foreign to the Indian way of life. For example, British education system focused on Western knowledge like the British history, having all young Indians learn the British ideals and norms. British also bought their industry practices while wearing off India's traditional methods. This slowly helped British ideals and systems in becoming more dominant over local ones. So diffusion contributed in India's permanent change of culture and had them face a lot of challenges. Operant conditioning proposes that animals and people could be controlled by the systematic manipulation of external rewards and punishments. For Canada, when British colonial implemented policies such as the Indian Act and residential schools, it forced indigenous people to adapt to foreign, more civilized system. In the Indian Act, indigenous people faced legal punishments for maintaining traditional ways of life, and were awarded for adapting the British way of life, one of the award being voting right. In residential schools, children were often physically punished for speaking their language or practicing their culture. For some children, if they adapted to the foreign system, they were awarded with better opportunities. which forced indigenous people to start living their life the foreign way, and unwillingly they slowly parted ways from their culture. Social benefits are things we get in society for behaving a certain way, is one of the part of cognitive process the British used to influence Indian behaviors and cultural norms. The British introduced new social expectations like Western clothing, language and education system. They made it be the better and a symbol of you being educated and civilized. Since it is human nature to want to fit in, Indians slowly started to adopt these way of life. This also gave you social benefits such as raises or opportunities for better jobs. And slowly the ones who rejected these new social norms were treated badly and seen as illiterate and unworthy. Race is grouping of people into categories based upon shared physical and social categories. It's not biological thing, rather it's a social constructed thing. This is what British used to divide Indian between each other. They created a hierarchy where the whiter you were, the more you resembled British people, meaning you were treated better, while the darker you were, the more different and therefore were seen as inferior. This helped the British maintain control over India and justify their exploitation. The division among people also worked in their favor, as it prevented unity among the people, making it easier for the British to rule. They also used religion to sedate people, which was something Indians never cared about. They used to respect each other's culture, but now they were killing each other cause of it. This separation still affects India today, as the divisions between different groups remain, making Indians racist to their own people and arguing over whose religion is superior. Discrimination is unequal treatment of people from certain group based on prejudice. Discrimination and injustice are deeply rooted in Canada's colonial history, as seen in the treatment of Indigenous people. The British created the Indian Act and residential schools, which reinforced systemic discrimination by controlling almost every aspect of Indigenous lives. They treated Indigenous people as inferior and forced them into a superior way of life. These policies denied human rights to Indigenous people and supported systemic inequality. Colonial actions like land theft, the disruption of traditional ways of life, and the destruction of Indigenous industries created long-lasting injustices. These effects are still seen today, with poverty and unemployment being common in these communities. My personal connection. As someone who has lived in both India and Canada, I have personally seen how colonization has greatly affected both countries. I have had my Indigenous friend tell me their stories about how colonization has and still affects them and their family. I also learned through school about Orange Shirt Day, residential schools, and all of their impacts, which has helped me gain some understanding of what Indigenous people have had to face. As for the colonization of India, it has greatly affected me and my family personally. We were originally from Pakistan, but had to move to India due to the partition created by the British. While traveling, my grandfather lost a lot of his family, as Muslims and Hindus were trying to kill each other. When he arrived in India, they lost all their land and had to start from the beginning, which put us and a lot of other people in India way behind the rest of the world. All my experiences and understanding have helped me grasp how colonization can ruin a country's values, norms, and culture. Conclusion. There are a lot of challenges we are facing right now, and will continue to face in the future if we don't take measures to fix them. There are many challenges, such as the ongoing land disputes, which don't seem like will get better anytime soon, especially since resource extraction and urban expansion are increasing. Colonized countries are also forgetting their culture, traditions, languages, and religions as generations pass, which can lead to the extinction of traditional ways of life. There is also the issue of a significant wealth gap in Canada between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, which is not helping with Indigenous people's struggles with poverty, getting better education, opportunities, and proper healthcare, leading to them living poorly and relying on the government to survive. Also the big issue of murders happening in both countries. In India, there are still rapes and murders happening because of religious differences, and the same is happening to Indigenous people in Canada. These issues can only be resolved by raising awareness of the situation, and most importantly, taking action. Because saying something is very easy, but standing by it and putting in the effort to fix the problem is hard, and something we really need to do. We also need to change the mindset, and have stricter punishments for those who are murdering and raping others just because of their culture and religion. Taking these steps will help improve the situation, and prevent these issues from continuing in the future.